Hello, I'm Pete Leiden. I'm the founder of Reinvent, the media company driving these conversations on the future here. And today we've got Rainie with us, who is the director of the Pew Research Center's Director of Internet and Technology Research. And the beauty of this is he has been doing this since 2000, for the last 17 years. There isn't a guy in America that can actually give us a better insight to what's been happening in those years. Thanks.
What a nice thing to say. Thanks,
True though. So talk a little bit, actually, because you're giving me a little context of your center and the roots of it. Explain, kind of what has happened over the last 17 years. You were established and how you grew into the font of wisdom that you are now.
I was a very lucky guy and got a grant from the Pew Charitable Trust, a big American charity of philanthropy, in the year 2000, and they were hoping to generate sort of dispassionate social science findings about the role of the internet in people's lives and the impact it was having on a host of things, because there were lots of arguments at the time about whether the internet was going to be good or destructive, and there were very few data points that people were bringing to those sort of theological arguments. So we were going to help at least bring data to those conversations, and we got a grant in the year 2000, and we've been in business ever since. And the mission statement was to study the social impact of the internet, which we eventually have now come to understand as a suite of digital tools. And so we began to study in the year 2007 the rise of the smartphone. And in the mid-aughts, we began to study the rise of social media. So we've really been the luckiest social scientists in the world, because on the subject we study, in the lifetime we've studied it, there have been 3 major revolutions, and we're in the midst of the 4th revolution. So as the internet broadband revolution was number 1, the mobile revolution was number 2. Now 77% of people have smartphones, 51% have tablet computers. And the social media revolution was the 3rd, and now 69% of Americans use some kind of social media platform, Facebook being the most dominant one. And we're beginning to study the Internet of Things, the artificial intelligence revolution, and stuff like that. So the story keeps unfolding.
So the 4th, when you mentioned the 4th, how would you define the 4th?
It's the cluster of things that people talk about when they say 4th Industrial Revolution, or the Internet of Things, or the rise of artificial and machine intelligence. All of those things. We wear the internet now, we drive in the internet, we enter internet censored rooms, we walk down internet censored streets. The environment itself is feeding lots of data back to us about how its basic health and how it's performing. So all of those cluster of things are part of the 4th revolution I think we're beginning to study.
And when you think about it, it's not like any of those go away. So when you say the 4th, it's not like it's sequential, like one up and down and one. It's like a layering or something. Is that how you?
That's exactly the right way to see it. You can't talk about people's broadband use without also talking to them about their smartphone, because the things go together now, and without talking to them about their social media use, which is the way that lots of their information in life is now mediated. It doesn't come necessarily first from big media companies, it comes from their buddies.
So given that we have this perspective, I mean, it's so beautiful. It starts in 2002, like the turn of the century, the turn of the millennium, however you want to think about it. Will you just remind people of how nascent things were back then? Is there a way to kind of capture how many people were on the internet, or just what we had really?
Fewer than half of American adults were on the internet at the time we did our first survey in March of 2000. About 2/3 of teenagers were, so it was a pretty popular thing with young folks. But virtually no one had a broadband connection. It was too expensive, it was hard to manage, there were some technical skills you would need to have to make it work for you. So we've gone from 0 broadband users at home now to 73%. We've gone from 0 smartphone owners at the dawn of our project now to 77%. We've gone from 0 social media users, if you discount, email is the social media, but if you look at it the way that the platform people would talk about it, the number was 0 in the year 2000 when we got started. It's now 69%. We've never seen a suite of consumer electronic technologies be adopted this fast with this much impact, and everybody's predicting the slope of the curve for the adoption of the next wave of internet tools and toys and gadgets will be even steeper.
And do you is it just focused on America, North America, U.S., or does it actually get into comparisons globally, Europe, or that kind of thing?
Our project has mostly focused on America. Our cousins at another Pew-funded project have begun to do some global work, and we've looked at other both developed and developing countries. And it's an interesting story. America's is the most cutting-edge story, where we get places first before other places do, but eventually lots of other places catch up. And what's most interesting to see now, for instance, in the work that we're doing with developing countries, is the minute someone becomes an internet user, they become a social media user, which was not the case with the rise of the internet in the United States. There's still about a third of internet users don't use social media in the United States. And that's almost unheard of in the Middle East and North Africa, in Asia, in Central America. The whole reason to go online is first and foremost to be a social media user.
And then China being this whole other weird alternative universe, do you guys ever dip into
Yes.
that or comparison with that?
We've done work in China. It's a bit of a challenge methodologically and getting the right relationships with vendors there. But yes, China has now more internet users than the United States. And they have a whole interesting set of histories with technology related to social media, but also the payment systems. And in some respects, some of their apps are more robust and more multidimensional than the apps that are available for Americans. So it's a really interesting story in China.
So you're kind of the big lens on the internet itself and technology pretty broadly. How do you think of the sharing economy? If you had to tell the sharing economy story, how does it layer into that across those years and its kind of relative importance or size or interest to you?
In many respects, it's a parallel story. From the earliest days of the internet, people began to swap things. And sometimes it was just literally a barter system. Sometimes it was a matching system. It was pretty crude. You did it through email, you did it through chat boards. But right now, our data show that for real platforms, for sharing economy, gig economy kinds of things, 72% of American adults have participated in one way, shape, or form. But it's a pretty broad, expansive definition. About 15% of people use Uber-like services. About 11% use Airbnb-like services. So a lot of it is the simple stuff like sharing goods and services, buying secondhand things, purchasing secondhand things, making little task-oriented things available to other people and like that. So, but it's a lot of people who are already sort of in the thick of this stuff, and you can just anticipate that the numbers are going to grow and grow. So 72% use these platforms. 8% actually build at least some element of their jobs around them. So Uber drivers or Airbnb renters or TaskRabbit type practitioners and stuff like that. A lot of the people who make money off the shared economy are actually just selling stuff. They're selling either secondhand goods or their own crafts or artisan type things. So it's still an emerging story.
And that crew, say the percentage of that last category of people that actually...
Well, the number of people who have made money is just over 20%, I think. Right. So 8% are in the real sort of things that almost everybody would consider gig type things, and there are a whole bunch of other people who are selling their secondhand goods or buying secondhand goods.
Now, again, you're as an interesting neutral observer and judge or something at that level. How do you define the sharing economy? Is that a term you use? Because a lot of people have used different terms: collaborative economy, gig economy. I'm just curious how you think about it.
We actually try to pin people down on this stuff because the definitions in so many cases are up for grabs, and different people think different things when they hear a term like that. So to get to that 72% number of how many people have taken advantage of the shared economy, we marched them through some matching services, some gig services, some selling services. Kickstarter was on our list and things. And anybody who said yes to any one of about 8 or 9 different kinds of activities that we considered on demand or sharing or gig things got counted in that mix. It wasn't an exhaustive list, though. There were things that we left off the list that some people wish we had put on.
Do you, without being too pedantic here, can you remember those 8? What are the kind of 8 areas or close to it?
So it was selling things and buying things. It was
So as an example, just again to get concrete.
Etsy.
So like an Etsy thing, okay,
Yeah.
buying something.
The ride-hailing services, abode sharing services, Kickstarter type or self-funded campaigns, selling secondhand goods, so gig work, so TaskRabbit and things like that were on the list.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's actually surprising in some ways. 70-some% of those.
That was a surprising number to us too, because it was. Yeah, I wish we'd asked the number earlier to sort of catch the moment that it began to become a thing in the culture, and we were fairly late to understanding how powerful and widespread it was.
But just to be clear here too, some people think of music sharing or sharing. You were not including that necessarily in that definition.
Yeah, we did include sort of creative sharing kinds of things. Not quite. If you've been on a GarageBand kind of thing where you've just jammed with other people on the internet, that we didn't count that.
But if you're sharing a file, a music file or something.
Nope, nothing like that.
Okay, just because again, some people go really broad on that.
Yeah.
That's interesting. Another thing which is interesting about this is how do you think of the platform economy, or do you use that in the way you think about things or organize your questions or about platforms themselves, or who's included in that, or how people think about that?
It's not a common enough word to be included in the survey language that we do. The big thing that Pew does is do these nationally representative telephone and now online surveys of people, and platform economy is not such a widely recognized word that we can actually talk to ordinary citizens about it, but we use it as a shorthand in the office. And for instance, when we did some work on the broad contours of the shared economy, one of the batches of questions we asked was the public policy questions, because we're very focused on civic life at Pew. And so one of the big questions is, do the people who work in platform services, does the Uber driver, does the Lyft driver, does the person who rents out her home or a room in her apartment, should they be regulated in the same way that hotels would be or taxis would be? And interestingly enough, the majority of Americans, especially the ones who are aware of these services, don't think that the old regulatory regimes for those services should be applied to the new ones. It's disputed. It's not 100%. Everybody says they're in a different realm. It's a divided number, but more rather than fewer think that they should be treated differently. We also asked, do you think these people ought to be considered workers for these companies? Or are they independent contractors? And again, a majority of people, not all people, said yes, they feel like contract workers. They're in a different line of work from actually going to the same place for the same purpose with the same company, getting a paycheck from that place. And so they shouldn't be treated in the same way and under the same regime of worker rules that other folks who work for companies do. So that's a long example of how we've talked to people about platform economies, and we can get really good, reasonable answers from folks who aren't necessarily even aware that that's the term. But and so we know it's a big enough thing that we have to talk to people about it, and we try to find sort of common language as an entry point for it.
That's very helpful, and it bled into something I really did want to explore with you. So it's really interesting that you say they don't want to be treated like in the old regime, but does that necessarily, did you ask them further whether they should be regulated in any kind of way or something?
Not so much any kind of way. We did ask, who's responsible if something goes wrong. Okay. A ride-hailing driver gets in an accident, who's responsible? And a lot of people said it's a shared responsibility. It can't just be on the driver's shoulders. It can't just be on the company's shoulders. Both of them have roles to play in the remedies that have to be imposed. But we didn't pin them down on rules and regulations, in part because it's such a localized, context-specific thing that when you do these big national surveys, there isn't, again, sort of a common language and a common set of proposals that everybody agrees either are up for debate or ought to be implemented.
So you never get to the level, because that's the inside of kind of the old regime doesn't work. That rings true. I can see some muddy side of that, but in general that makes sense. I guess I'm just trying to think, is there any other indications that people think there should be some kind of fundamental rethink of it, regulation, or a kind of just a different approach to public safety, a different approach to standards, a different approach to anything like that you could think about?
That's a fabulously important and interesting question. The general tone we get back from our surveys is that Americans are in a wait-and-see attitude. They don't have strong views about what regulatory regime ought to apply. They're still getting used to having these services available. In some cases, they aren't even available in some of the communities where we're talking to people. So in lots of ways, they are forgiving of the innovation culture. They don't want it to be stifled. They like the idea that some old stuff is being supplanted by maybe some better stuff. But they're perfectly, you can just watch over time how eventually people will probably say, okay, now that we know what this is, and now we know what some of the potential problems are with it, here's what kind of regulatory regime we'd like to apply to it. They're not there yet. They're watchful. They're basically supportive and encouraging and feel good about it.
Supportive
of these platforms rising up in a way that isn't necessarily mapping with the existing order of things.
Interesting. So you're just in such a good spot to kind of look at literally the last 17 years here, though. Is there any way that you think about the tracking of what people think of technology companies in general, internet companies, social media companies, platform companies? I mean, I guess however you want to think about them. I mean, they've, at least in a kind of anecdotal way, you think of them, they've been the darlings of the media, and they've been kind of could do no wrong in so many respects. But there seems to have been some kind of shifting of attitudes towards them in recent times. Could you describe that or talk about that in any way? Is that anything that's been seen in your surveys at all?
We have done extensive work on the issue of privacy, and it's been fascinating to watch over the 17 years, because our third survey in the year 2000 was about privacy, to watch how the American attitudes have evolved over that time. And many of the other things that I think are top of mind for you and the folks who are in the platform economy, the rules of the road haven't yet clarified to where people have strong policy preferences and thinking about it. So what we've seen in privacy is people have become more wary. They were pretty comfortable with the way things were. They're Americans, so privacy matters to them, and yet the paradox in our data that's existed for all time is people, Americans, say they like privacy and they like especially having control over their lives and their identities. At the same time, they do plenty of things where on the ground, on the street, in the middle of the transaction, with their neighbors, they don't act as if privacy was the preeminent thing that's on their mind. And so this is really confusing for researchers. It's really confusing for companies that don't want to cross boundaries that are very clear that Americans are going to hate them if they cross. But what's definitely happened, particularly since the Snowden revelations, which you might remember were followed very closely by the Target breach. So it's a 1-2 thing on surveillance, where the surveillance realities become exposed by the Snowden revelations.
What year are we talking about?
We're talking about the summer of 2013.
Okay.
June 2013, Snowden comes out. That fall was the Target breach. And so, in a way, Americans have conflated the idea of surveillance being something that's more prevalent in the digital age, as well as the data that are being collected by all these entities, both public entities and private entities, is a lot more vulnerable than we ever thought. You know, our credit card records get exposed, our personal information gets exposed. Now a ton of stuff, if you look at the Equifax breach, whole elements of our profiles and personalities are now exposed. So Americans are on a much higher state of alert on these things, and they're much less happy with the companies that are supposed to be stewards of these things than they were in the early days of our research like this. The other thing that's clearly happening, and I'm from Washington, so I'm particularly focused on these debates, is in the post-election era, the post-2016 election, where there's now so much concern about fake news and about the way that the platform systems can be abused and gamed and exploited for taking advantage of human vulnerabilities. There's more policy focus on that. Americans are are still trying to understand everything that happened to them, but there's a lot more concern about both the size of the companies and the way that they are available and exploitable by outside malevolent actors and things like that. So there's a sense that the internet's not in as good shape as it used to be. I mean, in a broad reading, Americans in particular, but people around the world are a little less happy with what they think the promise of the internet was than when we first started doing our work. You know, it's there. They still, when you ask them the basic question, here are all the things you like about it, here are all the things that you're worried about it, net, what's your view? Most people would say, I couldn't live without it. Even with all the troubles it brings to the culture and all the troubles it brings to my life. It's especially true of smartphones.
To take that one more beat though, just to, right now the 5 most valuable companies in the country, in the world, basically, are these technology platform companies. And, you know, when you started that survey, they were all, with maybe Apple's exception, and I guess Microsoft a little bit, but a lot of them are banging around as just startups and, you know, run by young folks. But now like Amazon and all the impact of disruption from these companies, I mean, are you sensing from a kind of just economic power prism? Are people worried about the size of them, or how much, any monopoly kind of sense of this, or that they've gotten too big, or that they're getting anything in that level? I'm just curious, because it does feel like something is shifting even in that realm too, but I'm not sure. I'm curious what you think.
We try to organize our work in a way that doesn't feel like brand management or brand assessment or even company-specific market kinds of information. It wouldn't be a good day for the Pew Research Center if something that we issued changed the market valuation of one of the companies we talked about. So we tend not to talk about companies specifically. What I can say, what I was describing before, there are concerns. Privacy is one of the areas where we've picked up a lot of direct evidence that there's concern just generally about the ecosystem of my identity and who has custody of it, and they're not happy with, in many cases, not trusting of the companies that keep it up. But we don't have, I think, what you're looking for, which is is there a sort of break the companies up kind of mentality in America? We don't test for that, and we don't try to go after that. I just came back from a trip to Europe, though, and a lot of Europeans are talking that way. They've been talking about it for a while. They don't like big American companies being so dominant on the digital landscape there, but that's not a public. It's mostly from talking to elites in those countries, and you know they're doing a lot.
I also had a similar trip over to Brussels, and it was a very interesting. That perspective is very different in some respects. But do you ever? I mean, again, I'm sorry I'm pushing this, but I'm literally trying to understand the nuance here. Is there any way you ever compare what people think about the tech sector compared to like Wall Street, or compared to the oil industry? I mean, do you ever think about what do people think of these companies relative to other big companies or powerful industries, or anything? What do you think about that?
We don't often frame our questions as company questions, but I can say that we have done a lot of comparative questions over the years about the role of certain things in people's lives, and still it's predictable as the sun rising the next morning. The role of technology and the enthusiasm for tech companies and tech inventors and innovators is really high in America. They still think it serves them well. They still like the ways in which they feel more productive. They feel more socially engaged. They feel like they learn new things. They can take better care of their health. So when you get down to sort of functions of technology in people's lives, Americans are still very enthusiastic about the stuff that was still turning them on, 17 years after we've been studying all this.
So there's no way to really think about how they think about old economy companies or anything.
Not
very well.
Yeah.
Okay, so how about looking forward? I mean, do you ever probe on emerging technologies or technology on the horizon, like the rise of AI or the rise of robots or the virtual reality, or things that are not hear that people are experiencing in any kind of day-to-day way? How do you talk about that, or if you do?
We asked some broad questions of the general public, particularly on subjects where we feel like their answers would be at least usefully considered kinds of answers. And people expect dramatic impacts from technology in the future. They do expect in the next 50 years a lot of jobs that are now performed by humans are going to be performed by robots and artificial intelligence. They do expect that cancer is going to be cured. They do expect that we're going to colonize other parts of the solar system. They do think that any number of technologies are going to be enacted, some of which are not particularly enchanting to them. They're pretty wary about some developments. The other methodology that we employ to talk about the future is to canvass a very broad database of experts about the future trajectory of technology. So it's not public opinion sampling, but we get thousands of people to answer questions and then explain their answers, and with some regularity issue reports about the future of AI and the future of trust and the future of truth. We just finished a survey on that, and so we do have insights into at least how the expert community is thinking about it, and the experts include technologists themselves, people who are working for the companies in the Valley, lots of scholars, so people who are studying this stuff and in many cases have direct relationships with those companies, and a lot of people in our database are sort of the builders. They don't necessarily, they're not on the front lines of innovation or invention, but they're building the websites and building the apps and watching the apps get used under certain circumstances, and those answers are pretty interesting part of the mix.
Interesting. Just in keeping with that survey, do you talk about technologies broadly, like biotechnologies or technologies that aren't classic IT information technology?
We've actually done some regular general population surveying about some elements of biotechnology. And the broad sort of pattern we see no matter whether it's biotechnology or digital technology or sometimes cognitive advancements and stuff, Americans, again, not everybody, but a majority start with a wary disposition. They, even when you promise them, well, this stuff probably will make you smarter, and probably will make you stronger and healthier, and probably will give you a better shot at a better high quality life, the starting point for many Americans tends to be show me. And there are a couple of things on their mind when they're expressing those wary attitudes. The first is that they are worried that these things will be safe. So it's one thing to promise me that genetic engineering might help a baby avoid getting a disease that she might otherwise get. But once you start fiddling around with the genome and stuff like that, who knows what's going to happen? And so they're worried about that. When we asked a series of questions about both biotechnology and digital technology, they're in the height of now the context of growing social inequality. And so a lot of people, again, thinking both about biotechnology as well as digital technology, say this is only going to make things worse because the rich and well-off and the well-prepared will be able to take advantage of this stuff. Those who are not well-prepared, those who are not well-trained, those who don't have the resources to be able to afford it are going to get farther behind. And so we're going to see the split in society get even worse, and that's not a good thing. The other
and just that inequality piece, in large numbers, is that when you generally have these wide surveys, that is a big concern?
Yeah, it's about a 65-35 or 60-40 proposition. So again, there are any number of people, and it tends to be the people who are well educated and people who are kind of tuned into the developments. If they're paying attention, they tend to be a bit more enthusiastic. But those who are not necessarily fully tuned in, or those who haven't followed these issues very closely, just start with a degree of skepticism that's interesting to see because it's such a pattern. It applies to every way that we ask it. The third thing that they worry about is that it will be put into implementation before, particularly with biotechnology, before it's well tested. And again, sort of to the degree that the rich can take advantage of it before the poor can, it's also going to be, it might seem like it's going to work, and it might be the first level of lab tests show it okay, but we need to have a couple of passes through this technology before we're sure whether it's going to work out the way you say it's going to work out.
And when you say it on the surface, I can see that Americans might have that caution walking into it. But comparatively to other parts of the world, which maybe you don't have that information, but I would assume that Americans tend to be more interested in adopting technologies quicker than other countries, or do you know anything to say about that?
There's limited data on that, but I think that's a good assumption. Just especially with the kind of broad questions about the impact and meaning of technology, we're a pretty enthusiastic culture for this stuff, and other people sort of watch with a bit more wariness.
Now, when you do these analyses, do you frequently or always break them down by generations or anything, or how do you what's your way of thinking about the different generations' attitudes towards this stuff?
One of the beautiful parts about doing well-designed, nationally representative surveys is you can get a lot of information about people and their circumstances. So all the demographic stuff matters to us, and we only tend to report the things where people are different, and there are differences at times related to technology on gender. We've done a lot of work about online harassment, and women's experiences of it and feelings about it are really different from men's for obvious reasons. The generational patterns are very prevalent in a lot of these things. That younger folks are just more enthusiastic and feel more on top of things and more competent and feel like they can make these things work for them. But they also are more likely than older folks to have had bad experiences. So younger folks are way more likely to have been harassed online, to have had privacy breaches online, to have had bad circumstances go bad in their social lives because of things that have happened online. So by doing it more, they experience both the sort of beneficial things or the things that they think are helpful, but also some of the problematic things. So generation is a huge part of the story. We're about to embark on a series of research projects next year to see whether there essentially is another generation younger than millennials. You know, generations are 18, 22, 23, 4 years difference, and millennials have been around for about 20 years now. The oldest millennials are 34, 35. And
the youngest then would be,
because this is maybe 18 or 20, and we don't actually. When you do generational research, you look for patterns in the younger or in the generations that are different. And once you begin to see that some generation looks different from the other, that's when you begin to draw the line. And one of the hypotheses we're testing, we have no idea whether it's true or not, is that the people who are now teenagers, especially late teenagers, may be significantly different from their 5-year-old, 10-year-old siblings, in part because they've grown up with mobile first as a reference point for digital technology, not wired first. They've grown up in an era where, in their earliest consciousness, President Obama was the only one they knew, and they've lived through the transition to the Trump era, and where some of the things that were so dominant about millennial lives, like 9/11, like the shootings in Colorado that were so searing to this generation, like the rise of the Great Recession in 2007, 2008. Those are not necessarily the formative things for people who are not even 10 years old at the time of the Great Recession started. So we're testing to see whether that starts to emerge in our data, and so that the generation story continues.
Do you guys have a working title that you call that?
This is one thing we don't need to do is we'll let somebody else brand them. And
what do you literally call them?
Post-millennials.
Oh, just post-millennials. Okay. It's interesting because I was kind of involved a little bit in that era of when it was Generation Y. Everyone was trying to figure out what it was, and then I was literally part of that early millennial framing thing in politics, at least in the early politics.
And it's a natural thing to do. There's certain people of a certain age who have absolutely similar experiences, especially in the broad culture, absolutely similar technology experiences, absolutely similar pop culture experiences. And so it's a real thing, although there's, the academic community sometimes gets itself tied up in knots about whether it's a legitimate way to characterize people or not. So anyway, we do generational research. We do a lot of we break down a lot of our data by class. So people who are better educated often look really different from people who don't have high levels of education. People who live in households with high levels of income look different from people who have lower levels of income. We do a lot related to race and ethnicity. So blacks and Hispanics and whites and Asian Americans all have different experiences, and we sort of highlight that in many respects. And from time to time, we also see community different experiences. People who grew up in suburbs or live in suburbs now, people who live in cities, and people particularly who live in rural areas are enough different and independently different, no matter what their age is, no matter what their economic status is, no matter what their gender is. There's something about being in a rural area that makes you different from somebody in an urban area. So from time to time, we see that too.
Is there anything that strikes you in that technology space that does make the urban-rural thing very different?
Politics and the way people use technology for politics, and of course, just literally broadband access. There's still a divide between rural communities and urban suburban communities where it's not nearly as available, and so their experiences and expectations and enthusiasms are not as high.
Is there any geographic, for example, the West Coast has got so many technology companies all the way up and down, and also it's a political kind of differentiation. Is there anything in terms of attitudes towards technology or
our samples tend not to be big enough to do, certainly to do state by state numbers. We do broad regions, and the West is different when it comes to technology. Way more earlier adopters, way more enthusiastic, somewhat more likely to have experienced any number of things, and both on the good side and the bad side. And more generally anticipatory about what's to come. They're more excited about what's around the corner. And Southerners, not so much because of their southernness, but tied to the slightly lower levels of education in the South and lower levels of income in the South. Southerners look somewhat different from others too.
Interesting.
I should say, politics sometimes matters a lot. It's not
about attitudes towards technology. Say more about that.
So it's not a demographic, obviously, whether you're a Republican or a Democrat or a liberal or a conservative. But we find that in some big instances, and particularly related to platform economy things. So when we ask about remedies for the platform economy or how to prepare for the platform economy, conservatives and Republicans are much less happy and enthusiastic about government programs. Guaranteed basic income doesn't go over too terribly well with them. Democrats kind of like it. Training regimes that are built around either K through 12 or university systems, conservatives are less enthusiastic about that than Democrats and liberals are. So there are times when we highlight that. Obviously, people's media use for politics, which now tends to be start or at least have a lot of reference points in their use of social media. There are significant differences in at least how people use it, how people think about it, where they get their sources, what they believe, the mainstream sources that they trust, and things like that. Republicans and Democrats have very different experiences and very different levels of trust depending on who the actors are in this story.
And is there any differentiation in general appreciation of it or general use of it in that respect, or is it more nuanced inside those?
No, it's just different things, which is an even more interesting story. So the general levels of enthusiasm are sort of equally high and equally low, but when you ask them about particular platforms or particular functions on platforms or particular media properties, there are very strong divergent views depending on which team you're on.
Well, speaking of that, we have a political issue that's emerging right now around net neutrality. So there's a specific political thing. Have you plumbed the issue on that, and particularly understanding the lens of how people feel about that?
We have not done survey work on net neutrality, in part because it's a very technical subject that lots of people don't fully understand, and even the term net neutrality itself is a fairly contested idea. And so people are thinking about different things when you use the phrase, depending on what's in their head. We did release a piece of work this week where we did a data analysis of the comments that were submitted to the Federal Communications Commission about the net neutrality or the undoing the net neutrality proposals that are now going to be considered by the FCC in the next couple of weeks. What we found is that the process itself, literally the comments submissions process, was riddled with inaccuracies and other kinds of errors and other kinds of ways the system was gamed, so that there were close to 22 million comments, and a large share of them sort of didn't look like the way that I think the designers of the comment system hoped that they would. There were fake emails addresses in them. There were people were gaming the system. They were using parts of the script of the Bee movie. You know, the animated movie, the Bee movie. That was a submission for part of it. They were using common names that are impossible to decipher. There were names that were done by name generators and email generators that vanished after the submission was made. So there are lots of ways that literally the process itself had issues, and to the degree that that process was seen as a proxy for public opinion, our report raised some issues about how to think about those 22 million submissions.
So kind of the chase in that, basically it was bots or kind of potentially
bots or just people gaming the system one way, shape, or another, not necessarily automated, but merging together systems and just spoofing it and things like that.
Which brings up, as we're kind of closing here, getting close to the end, cybersecurity. I mean, you talk about privacy, which is one thing. But what is people's attitudes towards cyber war, cybersecurity, Russian intervention in our elections? I mean, any of those kind of things? Have those
yes.
Say more about that.
So Americans first of all, have experienced data breaches themselves. I think well over half of Americans have had something personal of theirs sort of swiped, not necessarily online, but the data that they've generated, and they know about it. And they're not very savvy about cybersecurity. So we did a knowledge quiz about sort of what's a good, strong password. And a lot of people were okay identifying it, but then we asked, what's two-factor authentication? And we gave people examples of 4 screens that they could look at to see that, and a lot of people made mistakes. A lot of people made mistakes in thinking that they could use Wi-Fi, open Wi-Fi systems for personal activities and stuff like that. So Americans are worried way more now than they were just a couple of years ago, because the drumbeat of breaches has really become such a prominent cultural story. They tie this to their concerns about the companies not being particularly good stewards of their data and protecting their data. They're not happy that foreign actors now can get in the midst of elections, or get in the midst of there have been denial of service attacks that have taken down part of the internet. And so they are now more aware that we have vulnerabilities that are hard to manage, and even the most secure places, like the U.S. National Security Agency, has been hacked. And the tools that they developed for cyber warfare are now out in the open internet. And so Americans maybe aren't necessarily sure of that particular fact pattern, but they are definitely aware that we are vulnerable in ways that we didn't used to be, because all these connected devices have a power that they didn't used to have when they were dumb.
Interesting. Well, I tell you what, we're getting to the very end here. I'm taking your time, but I mean, 17 years. Have you ever reflected on what would happen in the next 17 years here or something? I mean, is there any long-term future you think about this space? It's only going to get more and more technological society. Any thoughts going forward on what you think's out there in the horizon at some point?
I have a permission from my funders to think about stuff like that all the time, which is such fun to do. So in one of the futurism surveys of experts that we did a couple of years ago, one of the things they said about sort of in the late 20s or early 2030s, they basically said the internet's going to fade into the background. When this much intelligence is put into it, when so many things are connected, the environment itself is connected, And the devices themselves don't necessarily become the main way that we mediate our interrelationships with each other and our data. It's going to be like electricity, right? Where if you didn't walk in this room today and the first thing you said was, "Oh, thank God I'm on electricity."
Mm-hmm.
You know, if the lights didn't work and the cameras couldn't roll, then you'd know that electricity was essential to your life and you'd care about it and you'd be mad that it didn't work. Well, you know, most technologies gain their most power when they become invisible, because they're so woven into people's lives that they almost unconsciously use them and take advantage of them and only are aware when they're not working. And there's every reason to think the internet's going to come to that place in people's lives within the next generation. We also think a lot about human enhancement and the many, many ways in which digitally smart objects and even smart body parts, even smart parts of our brain are going to become a commonplace. And there are lots of interesting ways to think about how the human-machine interrelationship is going to change and shift and how we're going to adjust to it. And there are lots of things to worry about in that environment. What happens to digital divides? What happens to people who can't take care of themselves? What happens when the machines get close enough to being as smart as us and maybe start, you know, taking over? And so there are lots of interesting things to continue to anticipate and to continue to research.
Well, it looks like you're going to have full employment for the Pew Research Internet and Technology crew for a while here, at least, and for yourself.
I'm very glad for that.
You have a good coming years here.
Yeah.
So it's great to have you here. It's been awesome to have this conversation and get a real insight into the overview of the amazing technology world we've been living through here.
It's been great to be with you.
Thank you.